We're currently in what I have called Matthew section 6, as I've divided up his gospel into sections. And this is, of course, from roughly the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the end of chapter 25. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because when he makes this final trip to Jerusalem before his crucifixion, he is very much focused on doing those kinds of things, and his teachings here are very much of that flavor. So it's a very confrontational ending to his ministry here in Matthew. And I'm now leading you through what I have called the fourth portion of section 6 of Matthew. So we've divided the gospel up again into sections, and then in each of those sections we have portions. This is the fourth portion of section 6, and it's just Matthew 23, so very easy to remember. Matthew chapter 23 is where we are right now, and I've titled this portion, The Heirs of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation. The heirs of Moses is what I have called the scribes and the Pharisees, whom Jesus is very much rebuking at this time in this particular portion of things. And he says that they have sat down in the chair of Moses, therefore I call them the heirs of Moses, to summarize that idea. And this portion is composed of these three warnings given by Jesus, all pertaining to the scribes and the Pharisees. So they each have their own audience, but they're all these warnings are about the scribes and the Pharisees there in Israel. And today I'm going to begin discussing the second of these three warnings, which is the longest and most classic of them. Of course, we have been talking about the first warning there in verses 1 through 12, but now we get to move forward into verses 13 through to most of this chapter, basically. This is the longest of these warnings and the one people remember most. This warning is the infamous listing of woes on the scribes and the Pharisees. So let's go ahead and read this particular passage for today. Matthew 23, verses 13 through 26, where Jesus says this, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated.' You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And you say, 'Whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated.' You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, 'If we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So that is the second warning that I have marked out for you in terms of outlining this. And my plan for today is to teach an introduction to all of this. Of course, I have several messages to teach through all of this, but today I just want to introduce you to it. And today, through this introduction, what I really want to do is I want to portray Jesus as the prophet par excellence. So that's also my title for this sermon, prophet par excellence. Par excellence is a phrase that we use sometimes, for those of you who have never heard that before, especially you younger people. To say something is par excellence, that means it is the most excellent of its kind. So when we say that Jesus is the prophet par excellence, I'm saying that he is the most excellent prophet there ever was. And I think that these woes on the scribes and the Pharisees show Jesus to be the most excellent among all the prophets. And of course, Israel had many prophets throughout their history, but Jesus, I think, out-prophets them all in that regard. Now, my outline for today has 3 headings, and I always like to give these to you so you know what I'm going to be discussing, so that you can be following along all the easier as I teach. So 3 headings. First of all, Jesus did teach verse 14 here in this chapter, but Matthew did not, which is kind of a curious way to say that, but I do want to talk about that, and you'll see what I mean when I get there. My second heading is the longest of them, and also is a bit of a, well, it's a bit over the top in terms of how I've worded it here, but the second heading is that Jesus pronounces this perfect prophetic reproof as the final parenthesis for his public preaching. So yes, I went a little crazy on the alliteration there, but that is what I really want. That's got the centerpiece of this message, just the nature of this prophetic reproof and how it functions, both to these men, the scribes and the Pharisees, and in the Gospel of Matthew. And then thirdly, finally, Jesus predicts the later, fuller display of hypocrisy and blindness among the scribes and the Pharisees. So as bad as it is here, where Jesus is rebuking them right now, it's actually going to get worse, and he tells them about that here at the very end. So those are the 3 things I want to do today. So today's sermon, really, when you think about it, is about embracing who you are by embracing who your Lord is. You know, figuring out who Jesus is and just what he's all about, and really embracing who you are now as a Christian, those of you who are Christians. Now, I've already mentioned in a previous sermon that Matthew 23 is mostly condemned today, even among biblical scholars, even among people that have made their living by studying the Bible and teaching it and writing about it. Matthew 23 is still not a popular passage. And really the whole thing is very fierce, but here in these woes on the scribes and the Pharisees, even more so. And so here on this second warning that Jesus gives, these woes on the scribes and the Pharisees, this is especially condemned today by practically anyone who reads this passage. It is simply not well received. Now, I've given a more formal and detailed response to that condemnation already. That was several messages ago, back at the beginning when we first started studying Matthew 23. But today I just want to say Jesus does not care about that, nor should any Christian. Right? So if you're interested in the more formal, detailed response I made, you can go back and listen to that sermon. Today I don't want to bother with any of that. I just want to say Jesus said this, and he didn't care how it made anybody feel, and we who are followers of Christ should also not care. As it turns out, this particular portion here, this particular passage within this portion really, is, I think, a very great display of the glory that Christ has as a prophet in particular. And we should just own that and rejoice in it. So hopefully today we can do that. although that is a rather strange thing to say. That is what I want us to do today. So let's begin studying through this passage as an introduction. And we'll start with that first heading I gave you, the one that probably doesn't very clearly say what I mean to say, but you'll understand here in a few minutes. That Jesus did teach, verse 14, but Matthew did not. Of course, Jesus is the one we're really studying, but Matthew is the one who wrote this gospel. And here we have sort of a strange point to make. This is one of those points which comes at the beginning of the sermon just because I want to get it out of the way. And I want to deal with this right here and now before we get any further. So I'm talking about verse 14, which I'll go ahead and read to you again. Verse 14, where it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive the greater condemnation." Now, this verse is almost certainly not an original part of Matthew's gospel. That is, when Matthew himself sat down to write this record of what Jesus did and taught, this verse was almost certainly not there. Now, some of you may have a note written on this verse somewhere in the margin or at the bottom of the page of your Bibles, which says something like this. This verse is not found in early manuscripts or early copies or whatever. It's probably worded different ways, but a lot of you probably have a note like that in your Bibles. Similarly, some of you might have Bibles that put this verse in brackets, those nice square-looking parentheses that tell you something weird is going on here. Well, I always like to comment on these kinds of verses and passages in the Bible, which have notes or brackets like that, to make sure you all know why the publishers of these printed Bibles made those kinds of decisions. I want you to have the full story so that you can take that with you as you think about these things and as you read the Bible on your own. Well, as I said, verse 14 is almost certainly not an original part of Matthew's gospel. And I think that is very clear, and that's why published Bibles like we have here in front of us are very plainly saying that. One piece of evidence is that this verse is indeed missing from the earliest copies of Matthew's gospel in our possession. We do have quite a few copies of Matthew, or partial copies, that include this particular portion. And in those very early copies of Matthew, this verse simply is not there, which is a pretty good sign that the verse was added later, that someone later on put this in there. Another piece of evidence is that those same early copies are actually found in different locations, so spread around like Northern Africa or Western Europe, all those different places where Christianity originally took root. So we have copies of Matthew from a lot of different places, and even in those different places, those early copies don't have this verse, verse 14, which is really important because it tells us that this verse was added to Matthew only in one location and only after the Gospel of Matthew had already circulated widely. So it's all the more reason to believe that this was not originally there. And then finally, we can say this. In those copies of Matthew which do have verse 14, sometimes they add it in different places. As a way of standardly printing it here, we put it here in verse 14, in which it's the second in this series of woes, but it's not always there. Sometimes it's at the front of the list, at the very top. So even when this was added in, people were adding it in somewhat different places. So kind of an interesting scenario here, but all that to say, all that evidence really makes a strong case that Matthew himself did not originally record this particular statement here in the middle of all these woes. Verse 14 is almost certainly not an original part of Matthew's gospel. However, we can see from Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel that Jesus did rebuke the scribes and the Pharisees with these words. So even if Matthew himself did not record them at this time, Mark and Luke actually did. And I want to show you this. You don't need to turn there. But if you were to turn to Mark's gospel at this same point in time in the ministry of Jesus, you will find the source of this added woe that we've been studying. And I'm going to go to Mark chapter 12. Again, you don't necessarily have to, but I'm going there for just a little bit. Mark 12, verses 38 through 40, in which Mark records this. In his teaching he was saying, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and chief seats in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses, and for appearance sake offer long prayers. these will receive greater condemnation. Now, as I've mentioned in my earlier sermons, this is Mark's abbreviated version of all that we've been studying in Matthew 23. Whereas Matthew gives a very long sermon from Jesus about the scribes and the Pharisees, Mark actually gives a much shorter version of this, and Luke himself does much the same thing. If you were to go to Luke's gospel, he has almost exactly the same thing down to the wording that Mark has. So here we see this abbreviated version of this longer sermon that we have for us recorded in Matthew. Now you might have noticed at the very end of this passage in Mark, Jesus criticizes the scribes by saying that they devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. Those words should sound very familiar to you. And also Jesus at that time finishes by saying these scribes will receive greater condemnation. Those words should also seem very familiar to you because those are exactly the words that we read over here in Matthew 23, verse 14, this added woe that I've been talking about. Those are the words that were added into Matthew's gospel later. So we can see from Mark and Luke that Jesus did rebuke the scribes with these words. It actually was a part of his sermon at that time. Now, knowing that, we can easily understand how this woe was added to Matthew's gospel later. Of course, this is just the active Christian copying and recopying of gospels. So it may help you to know as we think about this how it was added to Matthew's gospel. It might help you to know that the only part of Mark and Luke's account which cannot be found in the original text of Matthew is this part about widows and long prayers and greater condemnation. So as you look at Mark and Luke's account here where they give their abbreviated version of this, everything they say actually does show up in Matthew 23 at some point, except for this one part about devouring widows' houses and making long prayers and receiving greater condemnation. So it really seems like, for the sake of completeness, some Christian probably decided to add these words to the margins of his copy of the Gospel of Matthew, more accurately his church's copy, because in those days Bibles were kind of collectively owned by your churches. So at some point, some Christian who had custodianship over these things decided, you know what? The only thing Matthew doesn't mention here is this little piece that from Mark and Luke, so I'm going to write it in the margin there, just so we know it's there, for the sake of completeness. And then you can imagine, perhaps later on, that particular copy of Matthew was used to make another copy. Someone decided to make another copy of that to share it with another church or something like that. And when the copyist saw those words in the margin, he probably mistook it as something that belonged in the text. He said, oh, look, there's some other part here that was written in later. I need to make sure I get that. So he wrote it into the text of Matthew because he saw it there in the margin. And then, of course, other copies were made from that second copy, and so on and so on. And now we have copies of Matthew's gospel with this piece of Mark and Luke added into it. It all makes sense. It's a very simple thing, not at all anything unusual, especially when you start to study how the New Testament was copied and transmitted, but something that's certainly worth noting. So altogether, yeah, Jesus did teach that verse, but Matthew himself did not. It was not an original part of Matthew's gospel, but it was added in later by somebody from Mark or Luke because they actually did record it. And of course, the amazing thing with all of this is that we have enough copies of these biblical books going back a long time that we can actually see this and know what happened and make a pretty good guess as to what happened. So we can see these different copies of biblical books from different times and places, and we can actually use that as evidence to figure out these kinds of things. So this is the kind of thing where people might say, Stan, doesn't that make you trust the Bible a little less? And I say, no, it makes me trust the Bible a little bit more, actually, because we have such good records of these things that we can figure it out. So, all that to say, verse 14, not really a part of what Matthew wrote, but yeah, Jesus did teach that. Okay, so all that was just to get that out of the way. We come now to my second heading for today, and in this we come to the real content of this sermon, as well as that brutal piece of alliteration that I was giving you earlier. Jesus pronounces this perfect prophetic reproof as a final parenthesis for his public preaching. And that is the way I summarize everything I have to say here in the middle of this particular sermon. And I want to start with the key word for this second warning, the word that appears more often than any other, I think, and that is the word woe. I'm sure you noticed that as we were reading through it here. And I want to make sure the younger people especially understand this word. I did talk about this several messages ago when we were first starting Matthew 23. But this woe here, this refers to either great sorrow or it refers to an event which is going to cause great sorrow. So if someone ever talks about woe or someone says woe to you or anything like that, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about great sorrow or some event that's going to cause great sorrow. So when Jesus rebukes these scribes and Pharisees, he's warning them to expect great sorrow from God for their sins. So he's warning them in this way, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. Now, the prophets of Israel made frequent use of this word, woe. Jesus was not the first man by any means in Israel to use this word in this kind of way. This was a very standard word among the prophets. And we're going to go back to some Hebrew for a little bit here. And if you go back to the Old Testament, and if you're reading that in Hebrew, as some of us are able to do, you actually will see the word written as oi, right? So oi. And sometimes you might hear that word actually used in terms of people talking today. And it can be used much the same way as I've been describing. It can be an interjection referring to the threat of some great sorrow. So when you hear about this terrible thing or when you experience something terrible, you might say, oi. It's like just, oh no, this is the word they say, oi. Or it can be used as a noun, of course, referring to the sorrow itself or to these terrible events that are coming that are going to cause this kind of sorrow. So this word oi, as they said it in Hebrew, this word is most commonly used by the prophets of Israel toward the future victims of God's judgment. So whenever the prophet comes into town and he's giving his oracles of doom, which prophets very often did back there in the Old Testament, very often this word oi, as they would say it, would very much be there as one of the words that they would use for this. They also had a similar word in Hebrew, which is pronounced with an H at the beginning, so hoi, as they would say it. Very similar. Another kind of word that just refers to this sort of, this interjection of emotion, this word that you use to describe this passion that you have for this thing you're describing. In this case, most often, sorrow or sadness, the threat of judgment coming. So sometimes the word is written like that with a h at the very beginning. So oi or hoi, whatever. This is a very common word used by the Hebrew prophets of old as they were giving their declarations of God's judgment. Now eventually, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek. So a lot of people who could no longer read Hebrew could read it. And back in those days, Greek was a very well-spoken language. People knew that very often. And when that happened, both of these Hebrew words, so oi and hoi, were both translated as y. That's the way they write it in Greek. So if you read that, it's kind of an y sound. There's like two sounds in there. But that is the word used by Matthew when he wrote down Matthew 23. So as you see, woe, 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 it's this Greek word y. And in English, we just say woe. So that's all the kind of history of the word being used, but there's very much a link there between this word used by Jesus, as Matthew records this sermon, and these words that were used by the Hebrew prophets. This word woe to indicate this coming judgment from God that they would very often be talking about. Now, we can go a little more into detail with this, and I'm going to do that right here, right now, because we have two prophetic rebukes from the Old Testament which seem especially similar to what Jesus does in Matthew 23, in that both of these passages give a list of woes. Now, very often when you're reading the prophets in the Old Testament, you will see the word woe used somewhat often, but usually it's isolated, just maybe one woe to you, and then they move on to something else. It's not very common for them to give a whole list of these woes, but there are two times in the Old Testament where that does actually happen. And I want to read both of those for you because they are the support for some of my later comments about what Jesus says. The first of these prophetic rebukes is found in Isaiah chapter 5, starting in verse 8. So if you want to turn there, you can. I'm going to turn there so I can read it to you. I do want you to hear it if you don't actually follow along with me in your Bible. This is Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8, and I'm going to read through verse 23. Now, as I read this to you, you might occupy yourselves with two tasks if you want to have something to do with your mind while I'm reading this to you. First, you can count how many times Isaiah says woe, how many times this word is used. The second thing you can do is you might ask yourself, what kind of sinners are being condemned in this passage? Okay, so those are two things you might do as I'm reading this to you from here in Isaiah. So here we go, Isaiah chapter 5, verses 8 through 23. Here we go. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field, until there is no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears the Lord of hosts has sworn, surely many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine, and a homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, so that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening, that wine may inflame them. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. But they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of his hands. Therefore my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure, and Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her din of revelry, and the jubilant within her descend into it. So the common man will be humbled, and the man of importance will be abased. The eyes of the proud will also be abased, but the Lord of hosts will be exalted in judgment, and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it, and let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and come to pass that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good, and good evil, who substitute darkness for light, and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes, and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine, and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe, and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. And that's all Isaiah has to say in this particular list of woes. So there you have a list of woes against sinners, there from Isaiah chapter 5. Now I have a second prophetic rebuke that I want to read to you, again very similar to what Jesus does later. And this one is found in the book of the prophet Habakkuk. So Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 9. Again, if you want to turn there, you certainly can. But if not, I'm going to read it to you. And again, I'm going to give you the same basic tasks as I gave you with the Isaiah passage. You might count for yourself how many times he uses the word woe. And you might ask yourself what kinds of sinners are being rebuked in this particular prophecy of judgment here. So that's what you can ask yourself as I'm reading it to you. This is Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 9 through 20. So here we go. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house and puts his nest on high to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that peoples toil for fire, and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the destruction of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all of its inhabitants. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, Awake, and to a mute stone, Arise, and that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside of it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. All right, so there's my second example of these lists of prophetic woes that we have from the prophets of the Old Testament. And again, we could go to some other passages where they just use the word woe in kind of an isolated way. But these two passages from Isaiah and Habakkuk are very similar to what comes later on when Jesus gives his list of woes. So right now I want to go to what Jesus says and does. And I want to make the point that Jesus out-prophesies both of these earlier prophets. When it comes to his list of woes, Jesus actually does better at being a prophet than either Isaiah or Habakkuk. And I have several reasons for saying this. I actually have 4 reasons altogether. So to begin with a simple observation, the number of woes given by Jesus is greater than Isaiah, who gave 6, and greater than Habakkuk, who gave only 4. And I told you might be counting those as I was reading those two passages. Well, the numbers are Isaiah 6, Habakkuk 4. Jesus, however, gives 7, right, in Matthew 23. And if you insist on counting the woe, which is borrowed somewhat from Mark and Luke, you have 8 woes, which is even more. But I, however, am going more with the number 7. And at 7 woes, Jesus has the longer list. So if you're just in terms of just counting things, if you're just going to go on like bare minimum details like that, Jesus gives a stronger list of woes in that there are more of them. But we can say other things besides this. Jesus confronts the scribes and the Pharisees about religious sins. Now there's a point worth making. You see, as you read those other passages from Isaiah and Habakkuk, you might have noticed that all the sins being rebuked were the standard flagrant sins, like drunkenness, idolatry, thievery, violence, oppression, the kind of stuff that's very noticeably bad, especially if you in any way have any kind of commitment to the God of Israel. You know this stuff is bad. It's pretty obvious. All of that is very typical, very expected, very common, which means, honestly, what Isaiah and Habakkuk are doing is not all of that interesting now, is it? Because they're attacking the common sins. But Jesus, meanwhile, he rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees for sins which most people would not have been able to identify as sins. Most of the people of Israel at that time would have looked at the scribes and the Pharisees as the most knowledgeable, the most holy people in their entire nation. They were the golden standard when it came to being a religious person. And yet Jesus rebukes them for their sins. And their sins, as Jesus talks about them, are all very religious sins. It's almost like the scribes and the Pharisees, as they come to Jesus with the evidences of their piety, Jesus just smacks all that stuff out of their hand and says, woe to you. Those are the very reasons that I'm condemning you right now. So Jesus, altogether then, is actually the more insightful and the bolder, and at the very least, he's the most unique among the prophets. Whereas the prophets would give these strong invectives against very common sins, Jesus targets sins that most people would not have realized were sins, the religious sins, the sins of those people whom he calls hypocrites. So there's another way that Jesus out-prophesies Isaiah, Habakkuk, or any of the other prophets. I have a third reason for saying this, a third reason that Jesus out-prophesies Isaiah and Habakkuk, and that is Jesus describes eternal woe. So eternal woe. Now, true to form, neither Isaiah nor Habakkuk are very much interested in the afterlife. And I say true to form because for the most part, as you're reading the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophets, most of the stuff they talk about as in terms of calamity, judgment coming from God, they're very physical things. I mean, there are things like an army invading, locust plague, famine, whatever. Just those kinds of things. Very earthly things. They don't give a whole lot of attention to what we would call the afterlife, hell, not even heaven really, makes very much of an appearance in the Old Testament scriptures, and certainly not in the prophets. But Jesus, when he preaches this sermon against the scribes and the Pharisees, he makes it very clear that the stakes are eternal. He talks about hell. Twice, at least, that I can see here. In verse 15, where he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." So Christ makes it very clear that the stuff the scribes and the Pharisees are doing has destined them for hell, and also any who follows them. And then toward the very end here, verse 33, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell?" So there he's very clear about this. He makes it sound as though it's an impossibility at this point for them to escape that sentence. With those kinds of statements, Jesus makes his rebuke weightier than anything from the earlier prophets. The earlier prophets don't really talk about hell so much, but Jesus, he talks about hell, and he makes sure people know that it is a threat, it is a real danger. It's the woe he has in mind for these hypocrites and these blind men, these scribes and these Pharisees. One more thing here. Let's consider how powerfully these various woes have echoed throughout history. This is my last argument here for how Isaiah and Habakkuk are outdone by Jesus when Jesus gives his list of woes. When was the last time you heard someone say, Isaiah seems way out of line there in chapter 5 when he preaches those woes? When was the last time you ever heard anyone make that kind of comment about the book of Isaiah? I've never heard anyone make that comment. When was the last time you heard anyone say, I wonder how Habakkuk reconciles his list of woes with love? I've never heard anyone make that kind of statement about the book of Habakkuk. And the truth is, whether you're talking about Isaiah or Habakkuk, nobody really cares about that list of woes given by Isaiah, nor the list of woes given by Habakkuk, nor any of the woes uttered by the prophets. No one really gives them much thought. You yourself, in your regular Bible reading, you come around to these kinds of passages once a year, and you read them, and I trust you give them as much attention as you give any other part of the Bible, but it doesn't really stick in your mind. It doesn't really shake you in any way. But as for Jesus, people are still cringing 2,000 years later at the audacity of Jesus, and they wonder out loud if any man could be justified in saying such things. They come to Matthew 23 and they're all like, they're still gasping at all of this, and they're writing their books trying to either justify Jesus in some way as though he needed justification, or just outright saying Jesus shouldn't have said these things. Jesus caused quite a stir that no prophet ever caused. Even if in their own day, Isaiah and Habakkuk made quite a stir with those list of woes that they gave, it died out in their own time. But with Jesus, 2,000 years later, people are still talking about this list of woes that he gives. And this is a sign of the great power that these woes have as they were delivered by Christ. So all of those reasons together paint a very certain picture for us of Jesus. The whole truth of the matter is, this list of prophetic woes delivered by Jesus is perfect. In terms of how you think about a prophet, this guy that comes in there with his doom and gloom kind of prophecies, that kind of man is outdone by Jesus, who is the most ultimate form of the prophet. If for no other reason, we can say that Jesus has out-prophesied all of these men just based here on Matthew 23. And you know I'm right because there's 7 woes, right? 7 is the perfect number, right? The way we always talk about those kinds of things. Well, Jesus gives 7 woes, and that just seals the deal now, doesn't it? But quite beyond the number of them, as you think about the actual topic of his woes and the eternal implications and their unbroken power after 2,000 years, all of this together makes this the perfect prophetic utterance. Jesus has out-prophesied all of them here in Matthew 23. And because it is so perfect, Christ fittingly ends his public ministry with these woes. This is something you may have not considered as of yet, but I do want to point it out to you. This is, for the most part, the end of Jesus' public ministry. Now, here in Matthew 23, there is a brief passage following this one where he gives this warning to Jerusalem, 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 that kind of thing. It's very brief, however, and after that, the public ministry of Jesus is actually over. All of the teaching that Jesus does after this point is just in private with his disciples. There is no more public preaching like we see here. So, what we really have here in Matthew 23, and including this list of woes, are the final thoughts of Jesus on the sins of his own people, specifically the scribes and the Pharisees. And these final thoughts are pretty frightening. And that is how Jesus left the nation, so to speak, before his crucifixion. Now, many have observed, and this is just a point of contrast for you, that in the earliest sermon recorded by Matthew, he begins that with the Beatitudes. Remember the Sermon on the Mount and how it starts? Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and all those kinds of things. At the beginning of that sermon, Jesus gives a list of 8 or 9 blessings at the very beginning of his public ministry. And then after several years of ministry, Christ now ends that ministry with the opposite, a list of woes upon a nation which no longer knows how to repent, especially because of these scribes and the Pharisees who have been blinding the eyes of everyone and turning people against Christ. So, that is how Jesus ends his public ministry in the exact opposite fashion as he began it. And that is the effect of this perfect prophetic reproof. It is a final parenthesis, the closing point there of a parenthesis. It is the final parenthesis for his public preaching. And all of that is the majority of what I wanted to say to you today. But I do have one more heading. And this is interesting to consider. After all that we have seen, after Jesus spending the fullness of his prophetic power rebuking these men, we can still say that the hypocrisy and the blindness of the scribes and the Pharisees had not yet reached their full display. It's incredible to think that Jesus could give such a strong rebuke at this time. You would think, well, surely they must be the worst possible kind of sinners. But the answer is, not yet. They're going to get worse after this is all over here. And this is my final heading for today, that Jesus predicts the later, fuller display of hypocrisy and blindness among the scribes and the Pharisees. So, in true prophetic form, he actually makes a prediction. He actually says not just what's happening now, but what is going to happen in the future. And we see this in the last few verses of this second warning. I'm going to read verses 34 through 36. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So in spite of Jesus' fierce accusations, the scribes and the Pharisees do not yet have blood on their hands. That is the one thing they have not yet done. The one sin they have not yet committed, actually killing people or persecuting people or anything like that. But Jesus predicts what the end will be for the blindness and the hypocrisy of these men. And the end of these things will be violence. They're not done yet. They're going to get even blinder and even more hypocritical. And when that happens, it's going to become violent. These prophets, these wise men, and these scribes that Jesus mentioned are destined to be murdered, whipped, or pursued by these scribes and Pharisees. This is what Jesus says is going to happen to those who are, we understand that these are Christians who are these prophets and wise men and scribes. And the scribes and the Pharisees are going to go after them with all they have. And we may count Jesus himself as the very first of these martyrs. He was the first one they actually conspired to kill. And they crucified him not many days from this point, from Matthew 23. And others will afterward be mistreated or murdered by the scribes and the Pharisees, just in this line of martyrs that's going to come after Jesus. Now, I wanted to give you an example of this. And although this particular Pharisee is an unusual example, we might consider the efforts of Saul of Tarsus before he became a Christian. Because let's not forget, he was a Pharisee. He was one of these kinds of men that Jesus was denouncing at this point for their hypocritical and blind religion. So let's just go through the book of Acts really quick here. You don't have to turn there, but I'm going to turn to several passages actually from the book of Acts and just see the kinds of things that Saul of Tarsus was doing before he became a Christian. And just imagine, this is the kind of stuff that Jesus predicted that the scribes and the Pharisees would be doing. So let's just read a lot of these. The first of these is actually just after the death of Stephen, the very first Christian martyr. So Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered through the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women, he would put them in prison. So there's the beginning. We can go a little further to Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that's Christianity, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he's still at it here in chapter 9. And of course, soon thereafter he was converted. These last two passages are him looking back in hindsight over the kinds of things that he was doing before he became a Christian. So let's read Acts 22, verses 1 through 5. This is him addressing the mob that was at Jerusalem trying to kill him this time. He says this, he says, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense which I now offer to you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet, and he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city," that's Jerusalem, "educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women into prisons, as also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished." One more description that Paul makes during one of his trials. Acts 26, verses 9 through 11, where he says this, "So then I thought to myself that I had to do many hostile things to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were going to be put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme, and being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities." Now imagine that other Pharisees and scribes were engaged in similar activities. We think of Paul, or Saul as he was originally known, as the foremost of these early persecutors of the Christians. And he got that reputation for a reason. But according to the prediction made by Jesus, Paul would not be the only one doing those kinds of things. These other scribes and these Pharisees are going to join in. They're going to roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty. They're going to start killing Christians too. They're going to start putting them in prison. All of this is going to happen. Now just imagine that after these men hear this stern warning from Jesus, all of these woes, and this prediction that they would become murderers and persecutors, they actually become murderers and persecutors. They didn't take it to mind at all that Jesus warned them about this very thing. They just kept going. That's blindness. That's hypocrisy right there. And you can see how it really reached its full measure, not here in Matthew 23, but in the years following, when these men who were just hypocrites now became persecutors with blood on their hands. And that is the legacy, the ultimate end of their hypocrisy and their blindness, as predicted by Jesus. Well, as I said at the beginning, my plan for today was to teach an introduction to this particular second warning from Jesus here in Matthew 23. In this warning, we see Christ as the prophet par excellence, as the most excellent of all of the prophets. And I hope you see why I say that after dealing with this here and now in this particular introduction. I have 3 headings for today. I'll give you a summary of those just so you can be reminded of them before we close down for today. First of all, I made the argument that Jesus did teach verse 14, but Matthew did not. So this woe that we see written in there about devouring widows' houses and making long prayers for pretense and receiving a greater condemnation, it is recorded. Jesus did say that over in Mark and Luke, but somehow later on it found its way over in Matthew, even though Matthew himself seems not to have recorded it. Secondly, Jesus pronounces this perfect prophetic reproof as a final parenthesis for his public preaching. And here I made it very clear that Jesus out-prophesies all that came before him, even men that did very similar things with a list of woes. And this is how Jesus brings his public ministry to an end. Thirdly, Jesus predicts the later, fuller display of hypocrisy and blindness among the scribes and the Pharisees. And what he predicts is that they will turn violent, and indeed they did, as we can see from the book of Acts with men like Saul of Tarsus, although by God's grace that chiefest of the persecutors was actually converted. The others were not so fortunate and just continued on in their persecutions afterward. And that is the introduction that I have for you today for this particular warning. Whenever I teach next, I will begin teaching through the individual woes of this second warning. I think my next sermon will actually cover 2 of them at a time, the first 2 there, and after that we'll just work our way through them. So that is all I have for today. My voice is starting to get a little coarse here. So do we have any questions or comments at this time? And if not, we can just begin, well, I guess we'll have to order pizza first, but we can begin making ready for our meal. But are there questions or comments right now that I can answer? I don't see anyone jumping at the chance.